A special thank you to the Archie Bray Foundation for sponsoring this episode of Tales of the Red Clay Rambler. The Bray Clay business is your best source for Braypoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Braypoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. To place your order, call us at 406-442-2521 or order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com.
Welcome back to episode 498 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. As you can hear, I am a little under the weather. After 4 years of this pandemic, I finally got COVID, and I feel like I'm talking to you from somewhere underneath the Atlantic Ocean right now. It makes me feel dumb, so hopefully I'll be able to get through this intro without saying the wrong thing. So today on the show, I'm talking with Didem Mert. Her ceramic surface design combines collage, illustration, often building dense layers of printed images, patterns, and color. In this interview, we talk about the importance of spontaneous play in the studio, diversifying income streams, and using self-care to find emotional balance. To see examples of her work, you can visit her website. That's didemmert.com. Didem's going to be one of the presenters at the upcoming Florida Clay Conference that's happening February the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. At the Morian Center for Clay in St. Pete, Florida. She's going to be joined by Kyungmin Park, Justin Rosshank, and myself, and we're going to have a great time down there for 3 days of demonstrations, presentations, as well as an exhibition. If you'd like to join us for that conference, we'd love to have you. It's going to be hopefully sunny and warmer at that time of year in Florida, so come on and get out of the cold and get into the warm while we learn about clay. If you'd like to register for that, you can call 727-821-7162. You can also register online by going to morianartcenter.org and look for Florida Clay Conference. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview.
Let's start talking about Cincinnati, because you were raised in Cincinnati, right?
Yeah, so I was born in Cincinnati, 1990. And my parents immigrated to the States about 45 years ago. So my brother immigrated with them. I'm first gen. Grew up in Cincinnati because my dad was actually the first person in my family to immigrate to the States. And he went to the University of Cincinnati for ergonomic design. So he's a woodworker, and previous to all of these different, office supply chairs that are ergonomic and help your back and whatnot, he was actually sort of developing those. And still to this day, I remember looking at his thesis drawings and being like, Dad, why did you not bank on this? We could have made millions off this.
Does he come in your studio and be like, Didem, you need to sit up?
Surprisingly not, but if we're sitting at dinner, he will get so upset with me still to this day because I'll have my feet up on a chair and I'm sitting cross-legged and all sorts of craziness. He's like, why you got to sit like that in public?
So Ohio is was a big arts and or early 1900s ceramic spot.
Yes, Rookwood.
Yeah, by the time you got into clay, what was the scene like in Ohio?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to find through my high school art teacher, I was lucky enough to find Queen City Clay, which was originally Funky Fired Arts. And yeah, Queen City Clay was a big component of NCECA this past year. And like that's my home. Queen City Clay is. They have a new building since I first started working there, but I was essentially the guinea pig intern for a while. And then that led on to teaching at Queen City Clay and becoming like the Sunday manager. I kind of brought back hours, didn't do as many hours there once I got into undergrad, but learned everything that I know through Clay there. And Cincinnati has just like a great arts community. Started wood firing there, and that's not something that's on my current website, as I used to do a lot of wood firing. And I actually started out, I kind of did the opposite of what a lot of people do. I started off making ceramic sculpture and then moved on to making pots. And that was in my last year of undergrad where I solely focused on making pots. So I did the total reverse.
Can you explain for people that don't know that region, like the Kentucky tie in there and like that, just that region as a whole?
Yeah, so Cincinnati is one of those weird ones. I never really know, and I know it sounds silly, but I never really know where to say it is. It's sort of in the Midwest, but it's not. But because Cincinnati borders Kentucky, it's kind of in the South in a sense too. And it's also super weird because people in Cincinnati will be like, oh, you can't cross the border to Kentucky. And same thing goes for those in Kentucky. But growing up when I was younger, I would go to Kentucky several times a week because I'd go to my dad's wood shop, which was in Kentucky at the time, up until I think I turned about 10 or 12. His wood shop was in Kentucky. So I would always say, like, what's the big deal? You cross a bridge. And and I went to school at Northern Kentucky University as well. So it was cool to see the differences. Like just crossing that bridge, there's much of a difference, even in the architecture. Like thinking about Main Strasse, it's sort of like a very German sort of area within Covington, Kentucky, that's just right over the river. Um, so cool to see the differences of both.
When you got into when you got into clay to make sculpture, what were you making? Like, were you doing the figure, or what was your early non-pots work like?
So I think the thing that I think about first, and this was kind of like my intro into my love of clay. I was in high school. I took a sculpture and ceramics class, and I was super stoked. Like I always said when I was younger, I either wanted to be an artist, a gemologist, a mineralogist, or a chef. So I've just combined it all in one. But so I knew I was going to love the class, but I was like a freshman in high school and I was working on this coil pot project and it just got weird. Like I think I spent 4 hours in our office at home and I was just building upon it, putting like a tongue coming out and like teeth and all sorts of different work on there, different objects, and just completely fell in love with it at that point. So, in high school, I was doing sort of the projects, coil pots, sort of compression jars, and making them more sculptural at the same time. I worked with plaster a lot and mixed media. I mean, the fact that my dad's a woodworker, I had a great source of really beautiful woods and material. And then when I went into undergrad, a lot of my work was sort of skeletal in a sense, uh, sort of figurative, but more so in the animal sense. And again, I was working with mixed media, so doing bronze casting as well, found object along with ceramics. And I think that really had to do with the fact that, one of the things was going to Northern Kentucky University. I was already interested in diving into that route in terms of sculpture. But it just so happened that my professor, who's like a second mom to me, Anna England, she works in mixed media and has sort of similar themes going on in her work.
Isn't it amazing when you have someone that kind of takes you under their wing, like how much that means when you're a young person, just in terms of being a human being?
Yes, yeah. And her and I reconnected recently. There were a few years nothing happened, but there were a few years where we weren't catching up over the phone. And it's been so nice. I talked to her actually just last week and it was cute. We like sent each other holiday gifts and yeah, she'll always be like a motherly figure for me.
Is there a Turkish community in that region that you felt a part of?
Great question. So there's the Turkish American Cultural Society, and there's like pockets of that in major cities, but specifically with the University of Cincinnati, they, through the Turkish government, they were funding students to go get their masters at UC, the University of Cincinnati. So that's how my dad came over. Um, Turkish political systems are insane. So my dad actually had his scholarship revoked like his first day of classes and had to like work full time and make that work. But so there's a lot of families within Cincinnati that are from Turkey. So I would grow up going to different parties. They would celebrate some of the Muslim holidays. I'm not Muslim, but it was always fun, like celebrating Bayram and going and having little Turkish flags and whatnot. And yeah, I was totally immersed in that, the culture that my family grew up in when I was growing up. And still today, like if my mom's really pissed at me, she'll start talking to me in Turkish and I can understand the language, but I actually can't speak it. More recently, I was watching a show on Netflix and I was like, I want to listen to it in Turkish with the captions, and I bet I'll still understand what they're saying.
It's funny when I had that experience when I lived in China a lot. People would speak to me in Chinese and I could respond in English. But if there was a lot of miscommunication, is the point.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
A lot of frustration.
Yeah, especially when you pick up on certain words in a sentence and you think that you sort of know what they mean, and then you're like, oh, wait, I was way off with what I was thinking.
So with Turkish ceramics and actually just the bigger trade routes, like the Silk Road being kind of a trade network of goods and pattern that came through Turkey, how do you think that sense of pattern, and I'm thinking specifically like negative space, like I really see in your work the way you manipulate negative space is relating to that. But can you talk just a little bit about your understanding of kind of your core sense of aesthetics when it comes to pattern and color?
Yes, totally. So Iznik pottery specifically is a huge inspiration for my work. And since I started in clay, I've always wanted to find a way to mesh both worlds, like bringing in the culture of my family through generations, but also I'm first gen. And there's, a lot of strange feelings about all that. I'm like, what am I? But I'm constantly thinking about middle ground, foreground, background. And when I was about 20 years old, I took a trip to Turkey for a month. And that trip was specifically, to see family relatives, of course, but to immerse myself more in the arts. And I went to Selçuk, which is a pottery town in Turkey. And I got to see a gallery where thankfully I went with a cousin of mine and she was able to talk to some of the peeps that worked there and got to see the master potter who actually throws the pots. And then there's about 5 surface decorators. And I was just totally taken aback because I always thought they used rulers, maybe templates of some sort, but no, it's all free-handed. Some there's such symmetry and geometry within that work, but it is just second nature at this point. And the motifs that go into a lot of the imagery that's on Iznik pots and the rugs. There's so many different arts where it follows suit to what was done in one medium, it goes into another. So with my work, I've taken some of those elements, like the idea of symbolism and motifs. So like a pomegranate in Iznik arts, Iznik pottery, that means fertility, having like a prosperous life. So all of my designs that are on my work, it has a sort of backstory. And it might be something super simple, like if you see 3 lines or a multiplication of 3 lines, that relates back to when my dad taught me how to draft architectural drafting. And something that just went into my mind immediately was when he had said, a table, a chair, whatever, if it has a component of 3 legs, is going to be stronger than 4. And that has stuck with me since. And so even just seeing 3 lines or a multiplication of 3 lines on my work, it reverts back to that story. And then, if you see a banana on my work, that relates back to a conversation I had with a friend and us discussing what's the number one food you couldn't live without, and him saying bananas. So I think of all of my designs as a sort of story. So it's almost like hieroglyphs in a sense too. And it relates to tattoos as well.
Well, I think the listeners can hear that you're having fun. Like to
Oh
you,
yeah.
making is fun. It is not like a rigid thing. Which I want to compare two things. The work that you made when you were coming out of graduate school, you got a lot of press and a lot of like acclaim and following. Then fast forwarding to now, I can see that this is my opinion, that it seems like you're having more fun now than you were then. So can you talk about like having success with something that maybe is not fully your personality, and then really embracing your personality and making something that looks different, but that feels, I don't want to say authentic because they're both you, but like it feels, this work really matches your personality. It feels like hanging out with you, looking and holding those pots.
Yes. No, I'm so glad you picked up on that. Uh, when I dove into making pots, they were really stale. And like in terms of bringing my personality characteristics into the work, it it wasn't, I don't want to say it wasn't fun to be making. I was having a blast, but it did not show any of my sort of individuality into the work. And as I got into grad school, I wanted to try to feed into that more and dive into that. But at the time too, in terms of just design in general, I always say I think of myself more as a designer than just a potter. In terms of design too, at that moment in grad school, I was still more attracted to minimal design on pieces. So I was, pinching, putting my actual fingerprints into the work, bringing in pops of color. But I always visioned that my work would take that direction of like the more is more, like Isnick pottery. And I just didn't know how to do that. And I had several attempts while in grad school doing that, but it just didn't hit the nail for me quite yet. And I do get that question a lot in terms of style and changing a body of work because it can be a really stressful thing. But I've always wanted to stay true to what I want to make and to not care, how much press or how many galleries are reaching out wanting work. Because I feel like that does truly come naturally as long as, you're going with whatever you really want to do. I stopped making work once I moved to the California area, became a director at a studio, and I just didn't have the time or the emotional, mental, physical energy to be doing that. And I would like, make a few pots here and there on the weekly, but nothing that was really sticking. But I had all of these ideas. And during that time that I was in that position, just mentally, emotionally too, I was very down and depressed, and but thinking about ways that I could eventually make work that would bring in fun and play more so into what I was making. And through that idea, I also was thinking about, previous to this job, I was in Cincinnati. I had graduated from grad school, moved back to Cincy, and I just felt like a machine. I was making work that I knew that galleries wanted. And it wasn't that I was just making that because of that. I just didn't have the time when I was a studio potter after grad school to explore and test and do different things. And so that's when I needed a shift. So before I had that position in California, I went to the Bray for summer residency and really focused on forms, adding some more surface into the work, was still making the terracage work. But that was sort of an eye opener for me in terms of being immersed in that community and just all the fun we had as residents and with the community in general in the Helena area. So fast forward again. I had left my position at the studio in California, I believe in nearing the end of 2021. And there was definitely a moment where like I was super down. I stayed in bed for about a month, and was talking to therapists, psychiatrists, but I was like, do I even want to be in ceramics? Do I even want to make with clay anymore? And I have a lot of conversations with friends about that topic, because I think over the years, when you've been working in clay for quite a while, like you have this love for it, but you might think, well, do I really want to maybe work in another medium? Maybe I want to change career paths altogether. And ultimately, within that month where I was just super down, I made myself get up, do the dishes, and went into the studio and just started making whatever. It wasn't like I was trying to make something new, but I've always loved drawing. I've loved every medium of art, but specifically clay. So, very naturally, I started to bring in some of my drawings into the ceramic work. And I was really just looking for that outlet to get me out of this total head funk. And by mixing drawings, all sorts of different types of mediums to make the ceramic work, to make the pots, I've found more of an avenue of play and fun to make the work. So nothing's off the table. Like I will draw now on my iPad, on Procreate. I'll take those drawings, I'll cut stencils from vinyl on like a CNC cutting machine, and I'll mix that into the work. I still will work with mixed media occasionally. I made a small bud vase more recently where I put some metal tubing on it to like make this little leg for it to sit on. So I would say in every kiln firing I do, there's new stencils, drawings, new glaze tests. At least like 10 of the pieces are truly tests. And at this point, I know if I start to feel like the work is stale for me in terms of how I feel when making it, a change has got to happen. Or I might go from throwing to hand building. I bop back and forth depending on what I want and need.
Well, I think part of this, and I've heard you share about this before, but having ADHD and having a mind that goes in many different directions, you can make yourself focus, or you can relax and let your mind go where it wants. And it seems like now that's how your aesthetic is. Like you're pulling, like, for instance, the banana, having a banana come up in a conversation, and all of a sudden you're like, wait, I like this form. How do I use that? And then
Yes.
that goes into something that maybe if you were trying to rein yourself in, it wouldn't happen. So I think it's really valuable for people to hear that, like, it's okay if your brain is all over the place. Follow it and see what happens.
Yes, totally. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wasn't having as much fun before making work. Like after grad school, going back to Cincinnati, is I wasn't utilizing all those different things that I like to do. And I can't work on one thing for hours. I need to bob back and forth because of that ADHD. And it actually works in my favor so much. Like I love to design on the computer. I actually am one of those weirdos that loves logistical work, like spreadsheets and Google Drive and designing posters like for art access. I need those different avenues. So I might work on decorating pots for a couple hours on the couch with the dogs, and then I'll go back down to the studio. I'll maybe trim some pots that I threw yesterday, and maybe I need to start taking photographs for new shop update. Uh, I I hate doing the same thing all the time, so it definitely works in my favor.
Well, I want to go back to Iznik ware, that being a Turkish style of ceramics. And one of the things I love about that is you talked about it, foreground, middle ground, background, and also density. Like they'll have a lot happening within, like some of those big platters are like, I don't know, maybe a foot wide, but there's 40 blooms on there and leaves and stems and, it's all floral related, but there's so much happening. And I can see that in the way you're approaching your design, where there's like a bigger motif, like let's say a dog, like you'll often put that on a pot, but then behind that there'll be little lines, like repetitious little lines, and then on the other side there'll be color or some balance. So can you talk about how, when you're working with this foreground, middle ground, background, how do you find the balance? Because sometimes I think it's easy to have one motif dominate and the other to be subordinate, but it seems like you're managing to kind of put them all on the same level of importance, even if some are small and some are big.
First of all, I hate symmetry. I can't stand symmetry, which is kind of unlike Isnik pots. I'm going in that opposite direction where I do want a lot of surface design, but I do want certain focal points. So like when you see a larger stencil of a dog, um, that is like the first thing that might catch your eye. But then, yeah, you have other drawings, elements that are around that. Something that I'll think about quite often is color. So, and not only that, but also visual texture and tactile texture. So the focal point being the dog, that might be in more of a glossy glaze. So it kind of has that reflection from the light, and you might miss it a little bit as you're looking at another section that has a drawing that is more of a matte surface texture and visual texture. So your eye will then go towards that. But then having some of those like tiny stippled dots, that kind of creates this background that can also become more of the middle ground as you look at a piece more closely. But from far away, you might not even see that it's stippled like that. And then having just sections of color that will sort of take over. So I might have one section that has almost like a larger cow print of glaze, just to break up what's going on in a piece, so that you're not going from one drawing image of like a dog to then a skull with its eyes bulging out. So trying to think about how to break up a sort of story within the piece, I think, is important, because you're gonna see a mug from all sides. Well, how can I break up all that surface and information within these sort of guidelines or headers of like a document? So there's the stippling, there's the large patches of glaze, there are the drawings slash stencils, and then luster, I would say, is another header on a Word document, if you will.
I love that you have this system of organization in your head. And as you talk about the Word document, it does make me understand where you're drawing from. Because sometimes I like to look at your pots. As I was doing research for this, I was like, I'm trying to understand what does this mean? So like my brain is cycling through like, okay, this I think means this and this, like there's a visual organization that happens with me as the viewer. So it's interesting to hear that's happening for you as the maker. That's how you keep track and make sense of it all.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with growing up watching my dad with woodworking. Seeing those different steps, taking that rough sawn wood, putting it through the planer, cutting, sanding, finishing, going from those steps of like a heavier grit to a finer grit. I've always kind of thought about things, which is funny with that ADHD. I am an organizational freak, so that's all stored up in my mind. Um, Also just thinking about the different mediums that I really love to work in. So like metalsmithing, small scale jewelry making. I haven't been able to do it for years because I'm like, okay, do I buy a kiln or do I buy metalsmithing equipment? Let's be real here. But I just fell in love with metalsmithing because of those backwards thinking steps. So it's a way for my brain to think about what is next, then next, then next. So that organization helps my brain to get things done.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com. Well, as we're talking, as you're moving your hands around, I can see your tattoos. You've mentioned that that's an influence. And I can see that in terms of with tattoos, and you can tell me how you think about this, but like there's almost like really prime real estate, like a tattoo someone else is going to see. But then there's also the quiet parts of your body that you're going to see, like the inside of your arm or something like that. So that's almost more like a personal thing. Like you put that image there because it's significant to you. And I think your pots have that sense that like they're not hidden because they're right there, but there's almost like special moments on each pot that are different than the main motif. So people have to use the pots to be able to figure all that out.
Yeah, you gotta really read the whole story, the whole surface, for sure. Yeah, and tattooing comes into play within the work as well, which I think is kind of funny because traditionally speaking, like the last time I went to Turkey when I was about 20, I got stared up and down for wearing a spaghetti strap shirt with all my tattoos. So it's funny that that's an inspiration that's in my work, along with Isnik pottery, the irony in that. But more recently, in the past year, I think, I purchased a tattoo machine and got super into tattooing itself because there's such an influence from that, but yet I wasn't tattooing. So I was like, well, I'll try this out. It was actually while I was headed to the Bray for their annual auction last year, and I was going with Jamie and my friend Hannah, and we had always gotten tattoos together. And I was like, well, I'll just buy some stick and poke stuff real quick since we can't make an appointment this fast. And went on Amazon and was like, oh, I can buy a machine for $50. Research and development.
So who have you done it on?
I have given Jamie a tattoo, Hannah. I've given my friends, David a tattoo, my friend Catherine,
awesome.
Henry. Yeah.
So
and
this
myself.
is like a regular thing you're doing. This was not like a one-off thing, like you are tattooing.
I'm doing it. Yeah. I mean, and it's not, and I don't mean any disrespect by tattooers by saying this. It's not what I want my full-time thing to be. It is my hobby, even though, I'm not apprenticing under anybody. I'm just an amateur trying to have fun. So that's why I call it my hobby. But talking about the ADHD too, there are times when I will be hyper fixated on one thing. So there were several months ago, where I was just like, I'm going to tattoo my legs like crazy. And then all of a sudden, one day I'll wake up and be like, I'm over that for now. Let's move on to the next thing that I want to do. And in the past few weeks, or I guess the past like month and a half, I've been quilting a lot.
Nice.
Yeah. So I bought back and forth. And every medium that I work in will then move into help whatever direction I'm going with the other, and specifically with pots, because that's what I always come back to. I might not sew for 2 years, but I always come back to making pots.
Yeah, and can you talk about the timeline of an idea in terms of let's compare pots, quilts, and tattoos? Because like tattoo, it's relatively fast and lasts a long time. Pots a little bit slower, also last a long time. But quilts, there's this sense of it's a slow material. Like you can't just like bust out a quilt. So can you talk about kind of pace of idea and how that changes between those three?
So what you're talking about, totally true in terms of the timing and of making. I am an oddball in that I would say that my pots, ceramics in general, take the longest. The quilts have been something for me that I can do more fast paced because I'm not trying to quilt as a professional quilter would. I'm not trained in sewing. So I'm like, I don't care how I iron this seam that's going to be hidden within the quilt before I bind it. I am going to iron it so it's all, messed up because I'm just trying to get that finished product. So yeah, if like a legitimate seamstress quilter looked on the innards of my quilt, I am not doing a good job. But for me, it's more of like the collage aspect of it, working with patterns, colors, foreground, middle ground, background. Uh, and that again, like will translate into the pot. So it's more of a um it's more of an experiment kind of project that I don't want to say I'm not invested in. I'm very invested in it, but it's different. It's a different feeling.
And I think probably the levels of satisfaction are different. Like what you
Yes.
need out of a quilt to satisfy you is different than what you need out of a tattoo or a pot or a sculpture.
Yep. I'm like, I want to keep people warm with the quilts. And also, I think about it as a painting. So it has a totally different function altogether. Like, I love to collage with just random paper and materials as well. And that to me is a different form than the quilting, but it's one and the same. I'm just collaging with fabric. Like, I'm not sitting there cutting, the same sized square for the whole quilt. I'm like more recently, right before leaving town, I decided, you know what? I'm going to take all my little itty bitty scraps from sewing. And I mean, some of them are like an inch by an inch, and they just will create almost like a sliver of color pattern within a quilt. And this was more of a project that I did because normally I wouldn't want to do that. Like, it is a lot to look at. I'm all about more is more, but I still want some big patches of nothing and on a quilt specifically. But I was like, you know what, this will be good, a good learning experience. And I found that once it's almost finished, I still have to bind it and do the edges and everything. But I took a picture of it and I've been looking at it and I'm actually falling in love with it. Again, play, having fun, trying things that I normally wouldn't do and not. I think the biggest thing is not judging it too quickly before the finished state and not leaving it, which is very hard with ADHD, not leaving that until seeing it finished. That's huge because you'll never truly know how you feel about whatever it is you're making, doing, trying until you see that finished product and live with it for a while. Can't throw it away, can't give it away. You got to live with it.
Well, one of the things I admire is the way that you approach making and the way you approach selling and the way you approach teaching is all the same. You're adventurous, you're taking risks. I mean, like just moving to California, for instance. Like it's hard to explain how expensive California is until you live there. And then you're like, "Oh, right. Like this is a very different way of living." So, it seems to me that the way you've been able to deal with that is to expand the ways you sell. So you sell directly through shop updates, you sell through galleries, you teach workshops, you have the Mug of the Month Club, which is a way to sell pots almost on subscription. So, can you talk about that, like diversifying the way you sell as a way to keep things afloat in California?
Yes. Yeah. California, like you said, it is difficult. I mean, when I took a trip to Kentucky to see some friends, groceries, I think when I got groceries, it was about $60 there. In California, it's double, if not triple that, just to buy some groceries for the week. So, yeah, I've had to diversify how I am doing shop updates, selling in general. So, the Mug of the Month subscription, that was huge for me. And that idea actually came from the previous job I had. The reason why I moved to California, working at a clay studio, there was a membership program for members to come in, use the studio whenever they'd like while we were open. And just thinking about the expenses in Cali and going back to being a full time artist, I was like, having tons of anxiety about it. which I think was one of those reasons why for a minute I was like, do I want to stay in clay? So I started to think, how can I make it so that I know at least a certain amount of money is coming to me each month? And through that, thinking about the membership platform for a studio came the Mug of the Month Club. So the perks of that are it's lesser in terms of money for somebody to be able to buy a mug every month. So typically my mugs at this point run anywhere from like $160 to about 250, I'd say. And the Mug of the Month subscription is $100 a month, which actually I think I'm going to increase it slightly since yeah. And with that, you get free shipping as well. And so it's a pretty steep discount. So it's great for those that might want my work but can't, necessarily afford one piece. And it also helps me, and I'm very clear about that on my website when you go to sign up for the subscription. Like, it helps me in knowing my finances. Like, okay, cool, I'm gonna not be eating ramen for a month. So that's been huge. And like, I won't lie, I'm pretty open about money things. Like right now, girl be broke. So I am like, all right, it's time to put a workshop up on my website tomorrow. Gonna be teaching, I think lamps and clocks is what I decided on. And I used to have some issues with thinking in these ways because I think about like corporate America, but it was actually through a therapy session I had about a couple years ago before I had left my job. And I was talking to her about money and how I feel weird trying to sometimes sell my work, which is so stupid. It's such a silly way of thinking. Uh, but sometimes I get in my head and I'm like, oh, like feelings of consumerism and corporate America. But she had told me something like, well, you need to live. And you're not, you're not Amazon. You're not Target. You're not a petroleum company. Like, you're an artist. So why are you having these ill feelings about trying to make sure that you can be a human in the world? So that really helped me just thinking about that more, journaling about that more. And so, yeah, now I'm like, all right, well, I got to have that shop update or put that workshop up because, yeah. And the workshops are actually another thing that came through just thinking about my previous job that I had, transitioning everything to Zoom since the pandemic. Like, I had never used Zoom before until I was like, all right, well, we're putting up workshops and classes online, I guess. So having learned how to create that platform, work for the studio, then going back into my own practice full time, I'm like, all right, well, let's teach some workshops online. And that's great because then those that can't travel to take a workshop can either sign up for a live workshop of mine through my website, and then the platform that I use is Zoom. Or I also sell the recordings. So yeah, it's a great way for me to make sure I can live well and also to allow others. I mean, I've had people abroad that have signed up for those workshops. And I always get kind of bummed because I'm like, oh, cool, so and so from so and so country is going to be in the workshop. And I'm like, oh, yeah, the time changed. So I guess they're going to watch the recording.
Well, this is a good kind of general topic about perception of self in a psychological sense and money.
Yeah.
Because a lot of artists struggle with this idea that, like, I think almost we were sold this romantic bill of goods that
Yes.
art for art's sake is really like what it is. And if we can just focus on that, it'll make us feel good. But the reality is, if you don't have enough money, you're going to be stressed. And if you're stressed, any other mental illness is going to be worse, or physical. Like some people, I've seen people as they get more stressed, they have their backs hurt. I've had that before. Like all these things will happen. So I want to kind of just talk in general about how taking care of yourself is often practical. So, how have you learned how to kind of have a practical self-care ritual in your life?
Yeah, love that question. I do want to relate back to the Mug of the Month Club and how I talk about needing to know like some of the money that's coming in every month in terms of my stress, anxiety. Uh, and on there, I believe I have a paragraph where I mention the idea of the starving artist and how that's bullshit. And it just is. Like, why why have we been taught that for so long? And at the same time, I don't need to make $1 million. I mean, that'd be cool. But my whole thing getting back into full-time making and just the things that I've learned over the years and specifically through the pandemic is I just want to make sure that I'm leading a happy life, that emotionally, mentally, I'm stable and uh not being like, "Oh, well, I don't want to get up and do that today," you know? And I think a lot of us have learned that through the pandemic that we should take the time to really do the things that matter that we care about and to be happy as possible, you know? And there's still going to be times of stress and whatnot, but I listen to my body a lot these days. So if I wake up one day and I love my to-do lists or else I'd be off the walls not knowing what to do. But if I wake up one day and I had, all these things to do, trim the pots from yesterday, make 10 mugs, pack and ship these pots for a show. And if I wake up and I'm like, I'm feeling like physically, mentally, I need an off day, then I do that. And I don't question it. And if I decide, okay, I'm having an off day, and let's say I'm sitting with the dogs, giving them love, watching my favorite trash TV reality shows, and all of a sudden I have that itch once the Adderall kicks in that I want to go get some work done, then I do that. And I don't have any ill feelings in my mind about how I went from having a work day to then deciding I needed an off day to then wanting to go work. Also, throughout the day, I take a lot of breaks. I usually get up super early. So I'll wake up at about anywhere between 6 a.m. to like 7 a.m. Sometimes a little earlier if I'm having trouble sleeping. And take the dogs out, make coffee, and immediately first thing I do is go to the studio. And whether that be go down, my studio is below my apartment. So I might go down to the studio or I talking about mental health and just like physically too. I used to decorate pots in my studio, but now I decorate all my pots in my living room because that's where I feel like really cozy, and I feel cozy in my studio too. It's just different, it's a different vibe in the studio where you have, the machinery of the kiln and the wheel and a lot of different materials and whatnot around. Like my brain kind of goes crazy seeing all that in the studio because there is a ton of material and equipment. But in my living room, it's more curated in terms of, well, here are some of my favorite pieces from friends and all, that painting reminds me of my friend that made it. And that one time that, I don't know, we went out to a bar or whatever. And I I'm constantly working in front of the TV, and I know that sounds awful, but as somebody with ADHD, I need constant stimulation things happening around me. So it might be that the TV's on, but it's just like background noise. And also speaking physically in terms of taking care of ourselves, this is such a diva move. But it was right before the end of 2022. I was like, I wonder how much a massage heated chair is that's a recliner. So, yep, I did that. Bought one of those, tax write off. And you know what? I might be sitting there decorating work. I'm like, oh man, like my back hurts. And then I realized, oh yeah, I bought this for a reason. Another thing I'll do in terms of just like my body, because I also hold stress in my body, specifically my neck and shoulders. If I'm stressed, it can get to the point where I can't turn my head and where my back is just so sore. I'm grunting while getting up, and I never thought that that was actually a real grunt until I started having back issues. So I will sometimes forget to do this, but I try to schedule like body work, like a deep tissue massage, every few months. And, it's an expense. Can I afford it? Not necessarily, but what's the alternate, you know?
You can't afford not to do it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's more stressful in terms of expenses to not do it than to do it. So lots of little things to help. If I'm feeling like I'm about to go into a downstage depression, or if something's going on in my life, I will start journaling more. And I keep a journal. I don't do it daily. That's just not for me. I wish I could, but it's just not my personality. But if something just keeps repeating in my head, then I start to journal again. And yeah, meet with a psychiatrist and just make sure that I'm checking myself. That's the big thing. I think before, years ago, I wasn't checking myself.
Well, I feel like this is almost encouraged within graduate school cultures, and I'm not talking about the professors. I mean, within students, this idea that like you just got to work through it. Just keep pushing, keep pushing. But if you do that in your 20s or 30s, and you get to your 40s and 50s without having major back problems, mental health issues, like that's the ramifications of that. Just put your head down and work mentality. And I've really gotten a lot better since we had a child, basically.
Yeah.
Because now it's really easy to say like, oh, right, I can't work every weekend all weekend. Like that's not healthy. It wasn't healthy then, but I think I encouraged myself because I thought I'd have more shows, I'd have more work, I'd have more. And now I'm at a stage in life where I'm trying to like back it up and say like, well, what's practical in terms of working?
Yeah, I'm so glad that that's becoming more of a topic of conversation within not just our field, but just in general and, the workplace of America, because it's not feasible. It's just not. And I love that you brought up your kid because, I mean, I love dogs. I so wanted to adopt a dog. But one of the main points in that too, in adopting a dog, was to have that sweet little pup check me, because I can be really bad about holding myself accountable. But I find that now I have two dogs, but I find with them, they hold me accountable. I gotta make sure I'm loving on them, playing with them. They keep more of a routine for me too, in terms of waking up, taking them outside, feeding them at specific times. Uh, and that has helped. I might be working and I start to feel a little, and I'll see them and I'll go play with them for a little bit. And yeah, that's been a super help. And just emotionally speaking too, like how can you not have a blast watching one dog try to wake the other one up through barking to try to play? It definitely puts a smile on my face throughout the day.
Well, to wrap up, can you plug your social media and website so people can get in touch?
Yes. Website is www.didemmert.com, and that's Didem, M as in Mary, another M as in Mary, ERT as in Tom.com. And then my social media, Instagram is the same. My name, Didem Mert _pottery.
Well, this has been great. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too, Ben.
And I'll see you in Florida in like a month.
Yes. Florida Clay Conference.
I hope people will come down and participate with us in that.
Yeah, I'm so excited for that. That's going to be great to be with everybody. Thank you so much, Ben.
I'd like to thank Didem for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with her, and I look forward to seeing her in Florida for the Florida Clay Conference. If you'd like to register for that conference, you can go to morianartcenter.org/classes/Florida Clay Conference. I'd also like to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art and the Archie Bray Foundation. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. Also wanted to throw a plug out there for Patreon. That's one of the easiest ways you can support this show. And with your monthly donation or one-time donation, you get access to the back catalog of the show. That's the Tales from the Vault podcast feed, which is episodes that are no longer available on major podcast apps. To subscribe to that, you can go to patreon.com/redclayrambler. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in.
If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.